Great. Thank you very much, Belle. And on behalf of myself and sort of co-speakers, I'd certainly like to thank the organizers of National Invasive Species Awareness Week, and happy National Invasive Species Awareness Week to everybody. So thank you, Belle. Thanks to Chuck Bargeron, Rick Otis, and all the others on the organizing committee. I think it's a special privilege to be able to kick off the week to talk a little bit about the National Invasive Species Council, what it is, what we've been doing over the past year or so, as well as where we're going in the near term. As Belle mentioned, we've got a number of speakers, both from the council staff as well as our co-chair departments, and hopefully this will give you sort of a big picture overview in terms of what the council's doing, how some of the departments link in, and hopefully at the end of the day, how you can engage if you're interested. So when we're out and about, some of the questions we get logically are, what is NISC? Why is it important? Who's on the council? What does the council do? When does it meet? Things like that. And so what we're going to do over the next, hopefully 40, maybe 45 minutes is to go into some of these questions. And that should sort of give it, again, sort of an indication of the type of work that we're doing. So when we think about the council, we work primarily at sort of a whole of government perspective, looking across the U.S. federal government, but also how federal agencies link into other non-federal stakeholders, whether that be states, non-governmental organizations, industry, academia, et cetera. The broad purpose for the council is to provide the vision and national leadership necessary to coordinate, sustain, and expand federal efforts to safeguard the interests of the U.S. from invasive species and their impacts. And that's looking at prevention, eradication, control, and also restoration. And I think just to point on that last piece with restoration, we probably haven't thought enough about how the restoration, the resilience of ecosystems itself can serve as a sort of preventative approach towards biological invasions. This purpose was enshrined in two executive orders. The first executive order, which actually created the council, was from 1999. That's Executive Order 13112. And that one focused a lot in terms of raising awareness, getting the issue of invasive species on the agenda, both in terms of federal agencies as well as partners. And then in 2016, with sort of the experience and the activities of almost 2 decades, the executive order was updated and looking not just at the outreach and awareness aspects, but also some of the management questions. How do we get ahead of the game in terms of addressing invasive species and their impacts? When we think about the council itself, the executive orders state that it's the secretaries and administrators of 12 federal departments and 4 White House offices. The co-chairs are from the departments of Agriculture, Commerce, and the Interior. And as Belle mentioned, we have our senior advisors from those departments with us today. But as you can see from the other federal agencies that are listed, there is a very wide scope of coverage in terms of issues or perspectives on invasive species, whether it's from an international perspective with U.S. Agency for International Development and the State Department, a science perspective, a regulatory perspective, looking at health issues with Health and Human Services, transportation. So a lot of different pieces to the puzzle with regards to approaches and interest in invasive species. One thing that I think is particularly important looking at the updated executive order from 2016 was that it expanded the membership to include 3 additional White House offices, those being the Council on Environmental Quality, Office of Management and Budget, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And while prior to that, we definitely had a whole of government approach that was primarily across the departments. And by bringing in CEQ, OMB, and OSTP, there's more integration in terms of the White House and priorities coming, whether it's science priorities, budgetary priorities, things like that. So with the addition of those 3 members in 2016, I think we've sort of done a good job in terms of rounding out the full sort of facility of the federal government and its agencies. Now, if we think about sort of who is active on the council, obviously secretaries and administrators of federal departments are busy folks. So more on the operational side, the day-to-day work, we have two levels of engagement. We've got what are called principals, and that's the sort of high-level political representation on the council. They're political appointees, sometimes they're high-level civil servants. For example, with Department of the Interior, we have Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Scott Cameron. For USDA, Undersecretary Greg Ibach, and with NOAA, Chief of Staff Kevin Wheeler. So those folks who can work at a fairly high level within their departments to help us get clearance, have decisions, things like that. Then on a more day-to-day and programmatic basis, we have senior advisors for each of the departments. So on this call, we have Hillary, Phil, and Jeanette, who are our senior advisors for USDA, Interior, and Commerce/NOAA. And again, they sort of help us more with the day-to-day work on NISC priorities. There's also a small staff that helps support the work of the council, that being sort of myself, Jeff Morissette, who's our chief scientist, as well as Kelsey Brantley, who basically is behind the scenes overseeing all of our operations. And one final thing to note, and this was also looking at the movement sort of from sort of the 2016 executive order, was a recognition that there are a number of interagency committees that are working on different aspects of invasive species, and that we need to be thinking not just about coordination across the federal departments, but also looking at what are the linkages across these other sort of coordination bodies that address different aspects of invasive species. So the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, Federal Interagency Committee on Noxious and Exotic Weeds, on invasive terrestrial animals and pathogens, biocontrol, as well as integrated pest management. And these different groups all have their own sort of unique histories in terms of their founding documents, in terms of their memberships. But the important thing is they all address some aspect of invasive species, and many times there are areas where there might be overlap or the possible for synergy in terms of coordinating on invasive species issues. So we've certainly paid more attention in terms of how these groups can be engaged and how we can make sure that we are, again, developing those synergies and not duplicating efforts. Over the past year, so 2019 was a big sort of planning year for us in terms of we were moving out of what had been our third management plan, and then moving into what would come next in terms of thinking about our future work plan priorities. One of the things we did was sort of a retrospective analysis looking back at sort of the work of the council, the work that had been done, and we developed two key planning documents. The first document, which sort of enshrines a lot of what I just mentioned in terms of who's represented on the council, the principals, the senior advisors, how our work plans are developed, those were all codified in a terms of reference. So previously we had general guidance in the executive orders, but we have now sort of gotten a bit more specific in terms of what that means on a functional basis within a terms of reference document, which was adopted last October. And the other thing that we did was the development of an annual work plan. Now, our previous management plans had all been 3 years, 3-year periods. Some of them went over that 3-year mark. And the first two had upwards of 80 to 90 priority activities that could be done by NISC staff, by the individual agencies, by some combination. There was an effort in the third management plan, which had 30 to 40 priority activities to really narrow that down, look at what's the capacity to implement and deliver on elements in the NISC management plan. And I think in talking with the political leadership and looking forward to 2020, there were sort of two things that we specifically wanted to do. One was to make sure that the priorities that were being developed were flexible, and that so the NISC staff and the council itself could be flexible in terms of adapting to what priorities were being identified. The second thing was also making sure that the number of priorities we had met up with the capacity that we had in-house. And so in looking through and sorting through the priorities that we've developed for 2020, and I'll get to those in a moment, we came up with a number of criteria for how those could be established. So first and foremost, it would have to be a NISC member priority, but there would have to be 2 or more NISC agencies involved in that. And that really gets to the interdepartmental nature of the council and its work. That there would be alignment with agency goals and priorities, and that critically, there is a beneficial role that the NISC staff can play in working with the agencies and moving forward on these priorities. And then finally, it had to sort of achieve a number of just sort of strategic planning sort of criteria, priorities, specific, measurable, time-bound, et cetera. So at the end of that process, we came out with a 1-year, the 2020 fiscal year NISC work plan. And as opposed to 80 plus or 30 plus priority activities, we came down to 6. We probably started with 40 or 50, and then over a course of a number of discussions with our senior advisors, with the principals, again, came down to 6. And I think one of the things that this is valuable in doing is really saying, okay, these are the 6 key things that across the federal government we have identified as priorities. So it's easier to sort of identify those priorities rather than having to pick and choose across 30 or 40 odd different priorities. But also we looked at some of the activities that we had done in the past that needed sort of continuing attention, as well as looking to the future, what were some of the issues coming down the pike that we need to be paying attention to. So of the 6 priorities, the first 2 on rapid response, so lessons learned and emergency funding, came out of work that we had done under the 2016-2018 management plan. There was a significant focus there on early detection, rapid response. But as we came to the close of that, there was a recognition that there was still a little bit more to do on the rapid response side of things. So we specifically made the choice to continue that into 2 activities in the current work plan. Another thing that came up both within the executive order update from 2016 as well as the 2016-18 management plan was a focus on technology and innovation. And basically, how can we use new tools, new thinking to get ahead of the game in addressing invasive species and their impacts. And so in this work plan, we've included 2 items that reflect that. So work on environmental DNA, from research, from monitoring, to how does that inform decision-making. And then the second area is looking at advanced biotechnology applications. You may have heard of CRISPR, gene drives. What kinds of advanced biotechnology applications are out there that could be applied to invasive species? How do we address the risks? How do we do risk assessment, looking at those technologies or applications? How are they regulated, particularly at the federal level, but then there may be intersections with states, with local governments. And then finally, what are the processes for stakeholder engagement? What's the necessary in terms of education, in terms of buy-in, in terms of understanding these technologies and their implications? So we're excited to be able to continue that work around topics that relate to technology and innovation. A new area for the council, although not a new invasive species issue, is to focus on invasive species in wildland fire. And so this is the first time that it's been sort of put on our agenda as a sort of discrete item, and that's something that we'll be working on over the coming year. And then the final priority activity is the crosscut budget. And many of you may know that in the past, we've compiled data on federal spending on invasive species. And so we'll be picking up and continuing to do that as well. So that's sort of a brief look at what's in our 2020 work plan in terms of substance, as well as some of the bits and pieces that make the council run. What I'd like to do now is turn to our senior advisors from our 3 co-chair departments so that they can give you a little bit of perspective in terms of how they engage with NISC and how that intersects with the priorities that they have as a department. So I'm going to turn control over to Hillary Smith with the Department of the Interior. Hillary?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Vash. Can you hear me? Yes, perfect.
Okay, super. Just going to advance the slide. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Hillary Smith, Senior Advisor for Invasive Species with the Department of the Interior. And as a senior advisor, the primary role here is to help coordinate on invasive species issues within the Department of the Interior, as well as serve as a point of contact for other federal agencies and other stakeholders who are working on invasives, and to represent Interior with the National Invasive Species Council. So the Department of the Interior is proud to be a co-chair of NISC, as well as to host the NISC staff here at the department. So in the limited time I have, I'm going to give you just a quick overview of the Department of the Interior. We have a broad and diverse mission, which is to conserve and manage the nation's natural resources and cultural heritage for the benefit and enjoyment of the American people, to provide scientific and other information about natural resources and natural hazards, to address societal challenges and create opportunities for the American people, and to honor the nation's trust responsibilities or special commitments to American Indians, Alaska Natives, and affiliated island communities to help them prosper. Within the Department of the Interior, we have 10 different bureaus or agencies and offices, and each of these bureaus have their own missions, authorities, and roles and responsibilities. So for example, some of those responsibilities include managing a fifth of the country's land area, or 500 million surface acres, managing 1.76 billion acres of the outer continental shelf, upholding trust responsibilities to 573 federally recognized Indian tribes, supplying water to more than 30 million people in the United States, protecting the icons of our national heritage, and conserving fish, wildlife, and their habitats. And within each of our bureaus, they also have roles and responsibilities pertaining to invasive species. And again, I won't have time to go into the detail of each of the extensive activities that our agencies are involved in. And instead, I'll just focus on some of the overarching initiatives that we're leading here at the department under this administration. So first and foremost, I think we want to emphasize the importance of coordination. This is occurring at multiple levels throughout Interior. This is happening across our bureaus at our national level, as well as regional and local levels. Stash mentioned some of the interagency bodies and partnerships. Fish and Wildlife Service, for example, is a co-chair of the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, and a number of our bureaus are involved in any number of those different interagency bodies, as well as partnerships that are happening across the country. And certainly the coordination across jurisdictions is paramount to our work to address invasive species. And one example of that is the initiative under this administration called Safeguarding the West from Invasive Species, which specifically looked on strengthening federal, state, and tribal coordination to prevent, contain, and control zebra and quagga mussels in Western waters. We've also had a long emphasis on early detection and rapid response, and understanding how we can increase processes as well as capacities to implement these actions efficiently and effectively. And Stash mentioned some of the work under the NISC management plan. In 2016, Interior worked with other agencies to roll out the Safeguarding America's Lands and Waters from Invasive Species publication on early detection and rapid response. And we're continuing to focus on this through the work that Stash mentioned in the NISC annual work plan. Another emphasis under this administration is promoting regulatory efficiencies. And this is ensuring that we're meeting environmental compliance requirements while also proceeding with our management efforts as efficiently and effectively as possible. And lastly, in recent months, we've begun work on a department-wide invasive species strategic plan. This was in response to the John D. Dingell Jr. Conservation Management and Recreation Act of last spring. And so more to come on this effort, and this will provide an umbrella plan under which the work of Interior bureaus will be represented. So we're excited about these initiatives that we're leading through Interior and with our partners. But I do want to take a moment again and emphasize the work that Stash identified, those 6 priorities of the NISC Annual Work Plan. These are areas of interest to interior bureaus where we've been investing time and resources to move the needle, and they lend themselves very well for this interagency coordination. So our bureaus are involved in various work teams that NISC stood up to address each of these priority topics, and we're really excited to be a part of that team and to work towards what we think will be really valuable outcomes of this year's work plan. So thanks, Stosh, and I'll turn it over to Jeanette.
Oh.
Or to Phil, I believe.
Yeah. Thanks, Hillary. And let me just get control over to Phil.
All right, thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Phil Andriozzi. I'm the USDA Invasive Species Coordinator, and much as Hillary mentioned, my primary goals are to help build collaboration and communication amongst the many USDA agencies that work on invasive species issues, and to serve as a point of contact, primary point of contact, in engaging with NISC staff and my counterparts at the other NISC member departments and agencies. I'm going to talk a bit about USDA. I'm trying to advance this slide. There we go. Talk a bit about USDA and our, of course, our mission and some of our strategic goals. But I'm using that as a venue to discuss in a bit, just a touch of detail, the role that some of the USDA agencies play on invasive species work, and then I'll discuss how we interact with the intra-governmental with the other departments and with NISC staff activities that we're engaging in. USDA is made up of 29 agencies, many of which work on invasive species issues in part or the majority of their time. Over nearly 100,000 employees with locations and staff across the country and abroad. And our mission is to provide economic opportunity through innovation, helping rural America thrive, to promote agriculture production that better nourishes Americans while also helping feed others throughout the world, and to preserve our nation's natural resources through conservation, restored forests, improved watersheds, and healthy private working lands. USDA is constantly working to combat destructive invasive species in close collaboration with their partners. And this is, as I'll show, an essential part of our mission and our strategic goals to protect U.S. agricultural health. So USDA has 7 strategic goals, and as evidence of the importance of invasive species, I'll go through them and discuss how invasive species plays a significant role in each of these strategic goals. Our objectives intended to advance USDA success in combating invasive species through prevention, early detection, rapid response, control and management, restoration, education, and outreach. So the first strategic goal is to work efficiently, effectively, and with integrity and customer focus. USDA is streamlining our processes and improving stewardship of our resources and utilizing data-driven analysis to maximize our return on investment. And all agencies within USDA are charged with meeting these objectives, and these will all also help all of our efforts, including invasive species activities. Strategic goal number 2 is to help agricultural producers feed and clothe the world. USDA protects agricultural health by preventing and mitigating the spread of invasive species, agriculture pests, and diseases. The Animal Plant Health and Plant Health Inspection Service is the primary USDA agency that is charged with meeting this objective. APHIS, Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, safeguards the health of American agriculture and natural resources by evaluating imports of agricultural products and other pest pathways, and developing mitigations to prevent the introduction of invasive species. APHIS works around the world and concurrently with global and regional partners, federal agencies, states, U.S. territories, non-governmental organizations, and as I mentioned, international partners, to prevent the accidental introduction of invasive species and to manage and eradicate species that have already arrived in the United States. Strategic goal number 3 market American agricultural products worldwide. USDA is always working to expand international marketing opportunities and to prevent and resolve barriers to trade, including those related to invasive species. And the Foreign Agricultural Service, their core mission is to facilitate trade and international cooperation, and serves as a principal coordinator for these activities within USDA. Strategic goal number 5 is to employ technology and research to nurture private lands. USDA enhances conservation planning with science-based tools and information and promotes productive working lands and enhances productive agricultural landscapes. The Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, and the Farm Service Agency, or FSA, are charged with meeting these objectives. NRCS promotes conservation planning and provides assistance to cooperating landowners and federal agencies on adopting conservation practices on agricultural land, and the FSA administers USDA's Conservation Reserve Program. This is a voluntary program that helps agricultural producers and landowners use environmentally sensitive lands for conservation benefits, including combating invasive species. And lastly, strategic goal number 6 is to exercise wise stewardship of our national forests and lands. USDA seeks to ensure the lands and watersheds are sustainable, healthy, and productive, and mitigate wildlife risk. The U.S. Forest Service is a primary USDA agency charged with meeting these objectives. The Forest Service manages invasive species activities on 193 million acres of natural forests and grasslands, and as part of its forest and resource management activities has a number of programs intended to prevent invasive species introduction and spread, controlling threatening species, monitoring for new and looking for new detections, and restoring ecosystems damaged by invasive species, plants, insects, pathogens, etc. And lastly, the Agricultural Resource Service, Research Agency, that's a typo on my part, sorry, Agricultural Resource Service and the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, or NIFA, also have a significant role on invasive species and help all USDA agencies achieve these strategic goals and objectives. ARS is USDA's primary in-house research agency and provides scientific and technical support. It has significant involvement in pest management, including invasive species, through its extensive research infrastructure. While NIFA is actively engaged in the battle against invasive species by supporting research, education, and extension programs in the land-grant university system and other partner organizations. Now, NIFA does not actually perform the research, education, outreach, or the extension, but instead helps fund these programs at the state and local levels. So USDA has a lot of invasive species activities. Invasive species is a core component of the work we do to promote and develop American agriculture. Lastly, before I turn it over to Jeanette, I will mention that, as Stash mentioned, our principal is USDA Undersecretary Greg Ibaugh, Undersecretary for Marketing and Regulatory Programs. Myself and Samantha Simon serve as USDA point people to engage with NISC. We have a monthly invasive species working group from all different agencies to facilitate the communication and what's going on invasive species throughout the department. And that we're very proud of the fact that 6 of our agencies are actively involved in one way or another with each of the NISC 2020 work plan priority areas, and we're also very actively involved with ANSTF, FICMANU, ITAP, and all the other interagency working groups. This could easily be a much longer conversation about the work that USDA does on invasive species, but I will turn it over to Jeanette now and look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Hey, Jeanette, I'm giving you control.
Okay, then, thank you for that. Hello, everyone. My name is Jeanette Davis. I am the NOAA Invasive Species Coordinator, and I will be kind of giving an overview of NOAA's overall invasive species efforts. Okay. Just,
yeah, if you get like a little bit of time, go to the home for 2 days, very cool surfers. Cool little
Stash, if you could advance the next slide for me, please. Okay, there we go. So NOAA does have invasive species mandates. The Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force was discussed briefly earlier in this talk, and I just want to highlight that this was indeed a piece of legislation established by Congress, first through the Aquatic Nuisance Prevention and Control Act of 1990, and then it was reauthorized by the National Invasive Species Act in 1996, which collectively we call the Act. This particular piece of legislation is, it formed the task force, and the task force is co-chaired by U.S. Fish and Wildlife and NOAA. It is solely dedicated to preventing and controlling aquatic nuisance species. So I just want to highlight that's one of the differences between the NISC and the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force is it's solely aquatic. Just another quick thing about the task force that NOAA is co-chairs is that it tends to be more of a bottom-up approach in that based on the legislation, the structure kind of functions at the regional and state level where management plans are developed in each state, and then all of that information contributes to the national level where the group meets twice a year. And we have recently finished up our national strategy, which looks over how we can prevent and control aquatic invasive species over the next 5 years. Stash gave an overview of the NISC, but again, I just wanted to talk about two of NOAA's mandates, both co-chairing the NISC, which looks at invasive species as a whole and has that like higher level leadership, whereas the aquatic nuisance species is more of a bottom-up approach and is also something that NOAA works together with other agencies to do to prevent the control of invasive species. Next slide. So NOAA does not necessarily receive a budget line for addressing invasive species, but we have found ways to address invasive species creatively. We do that by looking at invasive species and problems that are directly related to us fulfilling our mission mandates. And on this slide are just a few of them. So for an example, Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation and Management Act. So we have a mandate to conserve species that are endangered as well, the Endangered Species Act. We have mandates to protect marine mammals. We have mandates to protect marine special areas. And so we look at invasive species that are directly related to our overall mission mandates. And again, that's just a few. Another way that we address invasive species is looking at our overall administrative priorities. So as you know, being in the federal government, of course, administration priorities do shift over time. And currently, one of our priorities in NOAA is focusing on the blue economy and how to sustainably harvest the economic power within the ocean, and of course, doing that sustainably. And within our blue economy initiative, we have something called an OMICS initiative. Actually, November of last year, NOAA released the NOAA OMICS strategy at the White House Summit, along with 3 other strategies. And this OMICS strategy essentially refers to a suite of tools and advanced methods that we can use to analyze various biological materials. So that's DNA, RNA, protein, metabolites. And NOAA has several different departments with different mandates, but we're finding that OMICS is a tool that we can use across all of our departments. Within OMICS is something called eDNA, which is also a priority of the NISC that was highlighted earlier today. And just briefly, you know, it tends to be faster, cheaper, less invasive, more robust than traditional methods, and has the ability to improve overall the delivery of NOAA's products and services. And within our strategy, we have 5 goals, which are listed here. One based on, enhancing infrastructure for OMICS, of course, supporting our blue economy. So that includes a lot of targeted and basic research. We want to accelerate how we do OMICS and move from the basic research into operations, expand our partnerships, which definitely is an umbrella under the NISC as well. And then, of course, promote workforce efficiency within there. And I just wanted to focus in on one particular goal for our OMICS strategy. I talked about this targeted research. Under that goal, there is an objective that is our biosurveillance objective, where we want to improve detecting and monitoring of harmful algal blooms, toxin, pathogens, and invasive species to protect health and coastal economies. So again, this is just an example how at NOAA we're being creative and strategic on how we are addressing invasive species and putting that into the larger context of our strategies. And here I have 2 examples highlighted. One where we partner with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, where we're developing eDNA tools to track walleye in Lake Washington. And this is really important to us because they prey on our endangered salmon. And so again, making that connection with how we're using overall priorities as well as mission mandates to address invasive species. And then another one I'll just quickly highlight is through Washington Sea Grant, where we partner with the University of Washington, where we're developing eDNA techniques to monitor European green crab. And I want to also highlight there that we do a lot of our invasive species outreach and prevention through Sea Grant overall. So lastly, I just want to say, NOAA continues to partner and collaborate with other interagency bodies, the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, the NISC, as I mentioned, and our eDNA efforts specifically not only helps our goals overall with our strategy and helping with other mission mandates, but lastly, it contributes to the NISC annual work plan, which one of the objective of eDNA was highlighted earlier in the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jeanette. And now I'm going to give the control to Jeff Morissette, who's our Chief Scientist. Jeff?
Okay, and just a sound check, am I coming through?
Yes, you are.
Hello. Okay, thanks. So to round out the talk, I'm going to go back to the National Invasive Species Council and the work of the staff, focusing on the science and technology coordination piece of what we're doing. But thanks to Jeanette and Phil and Hillary, I can't say how helpful it is to have that close collaboration with them, not just on this talk, but as we develop that terms of reference that Sash mentioned, as well as live into the 2020 work plan and the work that we're going to be doing on that. So let me see if I can get that to move forward. Okay. Not sure what happened there. Well, we kind of part of my portfolio is technology and innovation, and here we are. So it kind of makes sense that maybe I'm stumbling on it. So with respect to the research coordination, I'd like to borrow this slide. It's from David Lodge. I had the privilege of sharing the podium with him at the NISMA fall meeting, and he used this to show how this relationship between research through the knowledge and innovation connects with policy and management. That research is supposed to inform the policy, but the research shouldn't be done in a vacuum, and so it's sort of motivated by the policy and the decisions of what the agencies are moving forward with. So I like to take this graphic and kind of project it then through time as we iterate through that cycle, and hopefully that iteration leads to more effective solutions to fight invasive species. But I would also add, from the NISC perspective, we're looking at where that knowledge invention is coming from multiple agencies. So if NASA is doing something, how might that inform policy or management from some other agency, and how that policy and management decision and priorities are informing research that's being done, maybe with the National Science Foundation. So this cycle exists, and I think it was alluded to by the previous conversations within each of those agencies, especially the NISC member co-chair agencies, and a lot of work, research being done within those three. But what we try to do in the NISC staff and through the NISC activities is looking across that horizon of the federal agencies and helping as we iterate through that circle to have the most information and motivation coming out of that. Let me see if I can move forward here. Okay, another graphic from David Lodge shows that in a different way, where we have research teams and management boards, and I think the funding agency goes back to what Stash was highlighting as the advantages of having the Office of Management and Budget and the general kind of support through the NISC Council with respect to that continued funding, and then kind of trying to bring that research push and the management pull dichotomy together through bridging organizations, or sometimes referred to as bounding organizations. And NISC is a small part of it. Maybe it's part of a boundary chain or a connection between those two. But what we try to do is bring those together and make sure that the information is happening across those. And then again, by that high level policy and planning, especially at the in the White House offices, where that sustained funding can be a part of that connection and that bridging. I actually sit in Fort Collins, and as you'll see on this graphic, there's a number of federal agency research centers or other offices here by proximity and in coordination and collaboration, and by partnerships with these, trying to get an assessment of an understanding where that research is being done and where that connection can be made. And certainly, just as well as each of our co-chair agencies could probably have given their own talk about invasive species and what they're doing, each of these centers could probably detail a lot of work that they're doing with respect to invasive species. And so trying to bring that together as part of the research coordination activity that we're doing at NISC. And related to publications, so this is sort of kind of the tangible output of what we accomplish, or kind of a way to document that. We've had pilot projects. Mark Frey with National Park Service did a citizen science initiative called Invader Detectives. Michael Fisicelli with the Corps of Engineers did a report and a pilot study with us related to invasive species impact on federal infrastructure. Some of the scientific publications, more recently, there was a special issue of federal capacity with respect to early detection and rapid response that was in the Journal of Biological Invasion that just came out within the last month or so. We also have two special issues related to invasive arthropods or insects via the Annals of the Entomological Society of America. One of those will be focused on geospatial technologies, and one of those is going to be focused on advanced genetic technologies, and those are forthcoming. We also work to contribute to external publications. Stash was a major contributor to Bioinvasions in the Changing World that was led by the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force. NISC staff has been involved with the CDC-led domestic framework for vector-borne diseases in humans. And then last but not least, and certainly there's a wealth of information through the Invasive Species Advisory Committee white papers. More recently was an interface between invasive species and tick-borne diseases. All of these that I mentioned are available on the NISC website, except for those Entomological Society of America special issues, since those are forthcoming. But all the existing work is there and available for people to see. So looking at a Venn diagram that shows in some way science, policy, and management, which reflects kind of maybe Stash, Kelsey, and myself, where Kelsey is managing the day-to-day and the operations in NISC and keeping all the trains running on time, and Stash was referring to the policy, the terms of reference, what we're going on. We also have the science arm, and what we try to do is convene, coordinate, leverage, amplify the work that's being done across the federal agencies, especially towards those 6 management work plans for this year, but in general, trying to kind of meet at that intersection and make sure that we make the most of the activities that are being done. I think with that, we hand it back to Stash.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. And perhaps saving sort of one of the most important things for last, I think it's important to state that while there's a lot going on in the federal government, across the federal government, particularly as we've heard from our co-chair departments, we can't do this alone, and we're not doing it in a vacuum. So there's multiple areas where federal agencies are working with their partners at the state level, the local level, with academia and others. And so I wanted to sort of close by talking a little bit about stakeholder engagement. And for those familiar with NISC, Jeff mentioned the Invasive Species Advisory Committee. Last year, due to fiscal and administrative constraints, it was put on an administrative inactive status, and then its charter was not renewed. However, in discussion with the principals, and particularly the principals of the co-chair departments, there was a commitment in terms of how do we maintain stakeholder engagement in the activities that we're doing? How do we make sure that we continue to have the ties with our key non-federal constituencies? So we're in the process of developing a stakeholder engagement strategy, and there's 4 key areas of that. First, I'd mentioned the 6 work plan priority activities. So within each of those, we're identifying who are the key constituencies, where do they sit within the puzzle of that issue, whether it's sort of rapid response or eDNA, and then sort of identifying the key opportunities, the key players, and how we can engage and get input there. The second area is thinking about mechanisms for ongoing input. So without an ISAC meeting on a regular basis that often draws folks to town, whether it's during National Invasive Species Awareness Week or other times, we're looking for those opportunities for ongoing input. So if we can have sessions with NISA, potentially with the North American Invasive Species Management Conference, the one that was just had in Saratoga, there's another one coming up in Whitefish, even through Federal Register notices as we go through the process of developing our work plans. We're looking for those standing opportunities for stakeholder input. The third area is targeted stakeholder engagement, recognizing that there are a number of conferences held annually that are good convening points for folks with the invasive species community, whether that's the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, National Plant Board, National Association of State Departments of Agriculture. How do we sort of use those as opportunities to engage with various constituencies and get input? And I think it's critical to note here that it's not just the NISC staff doing this, but it's also our senior advisors and representatives from other departments who can talk about NISC, but also do so in a way that reflects the particular interests of their departments. And then finally, there's just sort of the outreach materials, websites, frequently asked questions, briefing materials, which we can make available as well. And so in that sense, there still is definitely an interest in figuring out how to bring the public and key constituencies into the discussion with federal agencies around invasive species. So on that note, I'd like to thank all of you for listening. Also, again, thank the organizers of NISA, Bell, and others for giving us this platform, and maybe we can use the rest of the time available for question and answer.
Thank you, Saj. That was really informative and really helpful information. We do have a few questions, so we'll definitely have time to get through these 3. And if anyone has additional questions, please type them in the question box in your control panel, and we'll get to as many as we can. We will also download these questions and post them on the NASMA YouTube channel with this video, or this webinar, which is being recorded today, in case we don't get to everything. So I'm going to start with Matt Bauer's question. He asks, the Western Governors Association chair from Hawaii, Governor, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce his name correctly, Ige, identified invasive species as its priority issue in 2018, resulting in the publication of its final report that can be found, and he lists a URL. I'm curious to know how NISC interacts with regional efforts such as the WGA effort to combat invasive species issues.
Okay, that's a great question, a nice leading question. In our previous management plans, we often had specific priorities centered around work in the Arctic or across the 3 countries of North America or in the Pacific. In the move to the current work plan, we're focused obviously more on topical issues. But I think there's still a recognition that a lot of great things are really coming up from regional initiatives, whether it's work in the Great Lakes on carp, on invasive mussels in the Columbia River Basin, the Pacific Northwest, or most of the West in general, or in the Everglades, looking at pythons and other invasive species issues there. So I think within the 6 priority work plan activities, we are trying to identify what the regional connections are. But also, I think we're looking at the Western Governors Association. They recently stood up a Western Invasive Species Council, which brings in representatives from the Western states, and looking at them as sort of key constituencies in terms of how do we identify and help them with the priorities that they have identified, whether that be on feral hogs or other issues, and then what are the connections that they might have to the NISC priorities. So I think there's still definitely an attention and recognition that a lot of the groundbreaking work is going on at a regional level, and so we're highly attentive in terms of how we can make the positive linkages there.
Great. Stash, and this is Hillary. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I just thought I'd add on that. So in addition to the work of trying to identify the intersections between the broader work of the Council, of the National Invasive Species Council and the Western Governors Association, within the Department of the Interior, we also have set up monthly calls with WGA to address a number of different issues and intersections between WGA's work and that within Interior bureaus. And likewise, and if Phil wanted to speak to this, he could as well, that WGA and USDA also have an MOU. So I think in particular, just to emphasize that there are great opportunities for coordination through the NISC as well as with individual departments. Thank you.
Thanks, Hillary. Did anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, Belle, this is Phil. Can you hear me?
Yep, sure can.
Yes, thank you, Hillary, for mentioning. Yes, an MOU between Secretary of Agriculture, specifically regarding Forest Service activities in the West, was signed as a result of the WGA, and we're also working with WGA and some of the member states on some of the other follow-up activities and actions called for, such as biocontrol and certainly invasive mussel issues in the West. And yes, as everybody's mentioned, this presentation could have been an hour plus for each of the agencies, for each of the departments and NISC staff. But thank you for this question, because it does illustrate how there's a lot going on, not specifically in the NISC annual work plan, and that it's where the NISC staff and Hillary, myself, and Jeanette are always involved in more different collaborative activities and looking for new ways in which we can get the right messages and build collaboration with our federal and non-federal partners.
Great, thanks, Phil. Let's move on to Kate Wilson's question, who asks, I see that invasive species and wildland fire assessment is in the 2020 NISC work plan. How does this work with existing efforts and products such as the National Wildfire Coordinating Committee, AIS, and Noxious Weed Guidelines, considered parent documents to many protocols in existence? Who is on the interagency task team? And are there opportunities for states and partners to participate to ensure that there is coordination across sectors? Lots of questions there.
Jeff, do you want to start by taking that, and then I can fill in?
Indeed, I think that we could share the roster if people are more interested, not maybe on the call, but who's involved with it. We have it's mainly federal agencies or agency folk who are on those the task teams, but we are, as Stash mentioned, looking to engage with stakeholders, and that's actually the first thing that we're digging into with the fire and invasives activity, is digging into about a dozen or so national strategies that have been written either on fire or invasives or at the intersection, one of which is the WGA Biosecurity Invasive Species Initiative. So what we're finding with that is quite a bit of recommendations and suggestions, all of them logical and valuable, but what are the ones where we could add value with respect to this higher level policy and planning. We've got the ear of the principals, the term that Stasha described, the NISC member agencies. So those recommendations that have come through quite a few documents over the years is something that we could kind of focus on a couple of things, 2 to 3, where those recommendations really are tangible and feasible to implement with that attention that we have at that high level. And we are working with the Wildland Fire Leadership Council, kind of making sure that this activity dovetails, or maybe even a joint activity. We're still in those discussions with WFLC on how this would proceed, but certainly want to respect those other entities and figure out where NISC staff and NISC Council in general can add value to a topic that has been going on for quite a while, and there have been quite a few recommendations related to it, trying to leverage those and take advantage of the attention that we're getting with this NISC priority action.
And I would just simply add, if there are folks on the webinar who are interested in particular issues, they can feel free to reach out to us.
Did anyone else want to add to that question? All right. Well, thank you again, everyone. Thank you to our panelists, especially for taking the time to give this really helpful and useful information for everyone. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm just going to close with a slide thanking again the National Invasive Species Council for pulling this together, and another plug for the rest of our webinar series this week, an additional National Invasive Species Awareness Week outreach tools. Please go to nisa.org or NASMA's page for NISA. Both of those URLs are shown there. And Staj mentioned a conference. I want to encourage everyone, as he mentioned, the NASMA annual conference coming up in October. It'll be a great opportunity. We hope to have a session that delves into more detail on what NISC is doing and how stakeholders can and are engaging. And there'll be just a lot of other fantastic sessions about all taxa invasive species issues. And on that note, we are at the hour mark. So thank you all again so much for joining us. This webinar was recorded and will be posted on NASMA's YouTube channel. So hopefully by tomorrow it will be posted, and you're welcome to share that and forward it to your colleagues. Thanks again to our panelists, and have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you all.